Hello to everyone. I'm really happy that I am in the position to host you all respected and experienced researchers of ICH, of intangible cultural heritage or intangible culture. And yes, as we all know, in the last 15 years, intangible cultural heritage has started to be a very important theme in museums, and more professionals in the museums are aware of its huge importance. However, it's all about ever-changing living heritage. So contrary to material objects, its content and values can't be stored or restored. Maybe even the word protection that comes from that material museum context, material museum world, is not the most appropriate. We might discuss about that as well. So many holders of that kind of heritage, of traditions, consider it something very personal, very intimate, and very precious. So we are going to discuss what all challenges, what all ethical dilemmas do we encounter as museum professionals when dealing with it. So I invite Jorijn Neyrinck as the first speaker to speak about that, to present her PowerPoint. She is highly competent in this area. She was conducting a very relevant, very important project, ICH and museums, which finished this year, if I'm not wrong, Jorijn. And she is one of the trained facilitators for the UNESCO 2003 convention, and by profession an anthropologist. And we anthropologists are especially sensitive to ICH as a theme, and probably we were the first aware of its relevance. So Jorijn, the so-called floor, imaginative floor, is yours. So please do start.
So we only have a short time for this first session to explore the ethical dilemmas at the interface between living heritage and museum practice. So I thought maybe it's interesting to make a mind map, like mind mapping the landscape of ethical questions to address, and launch also this idea of making of a third space, which I will go into later. And which was part of the trajectory with actually a few of the people that are attending also today. First of all, the UNESCO 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage has emerged like a new, additional, or complementary compass for global heritage actions in the 21st century, coming with a new paradigm with international collaboration around a series of instruments set out in operational directives, ethical principles, an overall results framework, and so on. Within this implementation of the new UNESCO Convention of 2003 in the field, throughout the years, a series of barriers have been perceived for safeguarding ICH also in or together with museums. Both sides have appeared to experience several barriers. Both sides, I mean, on the one hand, heritage communities, on the other hand, museum professionals, due to, for example, some fear of museumification, questions on decision-making and sharing governance, and so on. Nevertheless, museums are, I think we will all agree here in the room, key actors in the heritage field, powerful institutions in the field. And looking for the way forward, it was important to see how the twain can meet, which asked for dialogical encounters, which was the reason we tried to launch a third space or intersection approach a few years ago. This was the context in which we started up in 2015 already, the idea to have an ICH, or an Intangible Cultural Heritage and Museum project, around which we have gathered a whole series of partners, international partners on the one hand, like ICOM, the NEMO network in Europe, but also the ICH NGO Forum in the conventions context, and a series of European partners with support of the Creative Europe program. One of the main outcomes of this trajectory has been to search for an intersection approach, in which on the one hand museum functions and on the other hand intangible cultural heritage safeguarding measures, so the function approach meet each other. I will not go into it, but I think it's one of the ways in which the two worlds can find each other in the intersection zone that is in between. Which ethical questions and dilemmas come up at the interface of both paradigms or disciplines? I think both have an important set of ethical principles. First of all, of course, the ICOM Code of Ethics is well known to all of you. On the other hand, since a few years, there's also the UNESCO 2003 Convention Ethical Principles, 12 ethical principles, which have been launched for working around this convention and the safeguarding of intangible heritage. The main, and maybe first of all, a question which always comes up when addressing ethical questions and dilemmas at the interface of living heritage and museum practice, all circle around the question of participation, questions of co-creation, co-governance, and so on. The question to ask yourself is whether you are ready. Are you ready? Are you prepared to have the co-word, to go together? Because either you go the road together with the heritage communities involved, the communities, groups, and individuals concerned, either maybe you shouldn't go the ICH way. In the ethical principles, but I guess one of the following speakers will be entering into this dimension, is always on the X between autonomy of the heritage community on the one side of the X, and on the other side of the spectrum you have an intervention approach. In between, of course, you could go into the co-approach, collaboration. A question to ask yourself is also either you engage or either you better stay away. Because this is living heritage. As Lidija has also already introduced, it's very intimate. Living heritage practices are linked to the identity of people. Very often it goes very deep into their experience and their lives. And it's all about human relationships. So you could say with the museum statement from the past, do not touch, or at least do not touch without prior consent on mutual expectations. There's no need at all, to my opinion, to have the same or similar expectations. You can have different expectations which meet each other, but you should be very transparent, and you should agree on both sides about which road you're going together and how you will take into account each other's expectations, take care of the fragility of each other, and take into account the power imbalances that are there. Also, ask yourself whether you have the time, or are you willing to make the time, because these participatory processes are very intense, and if you cannot make the time it takes to take care of these processes, then maybe you should wait until you can really invest the time. It needs to go the road with the heritage communities. Another ethical question which always comes up is which role to play as a museum professional or a heritage institution. Will we go to present or will we represent? In between activism, mediating multi-perspectivity or multivocality, or facilitating dialogues, there's a lot of choices to be made. And it's an ethical question which beforehand you should be considering as a heritage institution. There's a lot of you shall nots or beware of. These circle around questions of decontextualization, commodification, appropriation or misappropriation, freezing, essentialization, authenticity questions, and so on. I guess all of these are issues we could have like 2 hours debate about in the coming sessions. All of these are also connected to questions of access and benefit sharing, to moral and intellectual rights of the people involved. There's another issue I would wish to raise and which raises huge debates actually time and again. That's to avoid to confuse a seemingly naive confusion of quite similar concepts like intangible culture, like the name of this meeting room. Also, the notion of intangible cultural heritage, intangible dimensions of tangible heritage, or what you could call the tautology of intangible values. It's a complex and a huge debate that is in this area, which we should surely go into, and which ask for a conceptual hygiene among us as heritage professionals, because it has a lot of moral consequences. Do we want to broaden the heritage work with intangible dimensions under a new trend umbrella of intangibles? Or do we want to join the efforts around supporting heritage communities in safeguarding their practices? Finally, I think the whole paradigm around living heritage or intangible heritage is also somewhere in the midst of the decolonizing heritage debates that are being fed everywhere currently. And it's somewhere in between reconciling troubled pasts, where often in the past we did not respect living practices. They were not really taken into account, and we are currently trying to see how we can reconcile with this past. But on the other hand, you have this whole perspective, which is in the ICH paradigm, and which actually is looking very much forward to the future, and which goes about living practices today and how we can safeguard them for a sustainable future in our world and living together in diversity. So there's also a whole series of related questions there. To finish, as I already introduced, we have been working for 5 years with a series of partners around the collaboration between museums and intangible heritage, with a lot of practical examples, case studies from the field, and so on. And the product of that is all online. There's a toolkit, there's a book, there's also some ethical aspects already, so you can find these all on the links which I have integrated here. I look forward to the discussion we will have.
Thank you so much. You touched so many aspects of intangible heritage. So I guess we would need years now to go through every of them, and certainly they're equally relevant. And I guess that Marc Jacobs, who is our next speaker, will certainly elaborate some of them. So Marc is a professor and head of the Department of Heritage Studies at the University of Antwerp, and holder of the UNESCO Chair for Critical Heritage Studies and Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. He is also a historian. He's holding a PhD in history. It has been working on many topics, including popular culture since 80s and intangible culture in this century. So Marc, please do continue with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just speak. I will see if I will mobilize my PowerPoint. As Lidija said in the beginning, there's that whole discussion about protection and this new word safeguarding. And as the word protection is part of the word safeguarding, it's avoided to, especially in translations into Dutch, for instance, to translate safeguarding into the Dutch equivalent of protection. And this indicates that it's something richer, some combined set of measures and approaches that is cultivated. What I like about the 2003 convention, it's an attempt to reboot the whole system of thinking on how to deal with living heritage and so on. And this system is partly captured by a little book, the Blue Book, the basic text that functions as a way to frame a number of debates and also to engage in a global discussion and a global negotiation on how to proceed. And as Jorijn already mentioned, there's that notion of operational directives. While this is a rather static and vague and ambiguous text. This is explained in other vague and ambiguous texts called the operational directives. But the advantage of the operational directives is that they can be changed and that they accumulate every 2 years. And since 2015, 2016, we have 2 major additions in the operational directives. On the one hand, a chapter on sustainable development and sustainable development goals that are on the Agenda 2030, been translated towards the convention. And on the other hand, this set of 12 principles also mentioned by Jorijn Neyrinck. And for me, these 2 items are facets of what I would call local ethics. So it's global ethics and local ethics combined into local ethics, and it's a way of approaching culture and intangible heritage from that localized perspective, but in a global setting. And if you look at the 12 ethical principles, and that's something that Jorijn already mentioned, I try to do that with my students to decode these 12 ethical principles, and it's very difficult to understand them because people get confused, and according to me and others, this is partly because there are 2 main ideas. On the one hand, emphasizing the relative autonomy of communities, groups, and individuals, the bearers of the local context of intangible cultural heritage on the one hand, and on the other hand, a series of interventions. And this Agenda 2030 is a good example of it. How can we save the world together? By trying to intervene in a number of habits and inequalities and try to settle them. And there's a tension between the 2. If you say, for instance, what is one of the sustainable development goals to emphasize gender equality and empowering women, that does not always, it's not always compatible with a number of, for instance, local ways of dealing with the world in a number of settings. And what should you do? Should you respect this local worldview, or should you embrace what is happening in the global sense? What I like about so 2 remarks about the ethical principles. There's an important notion there next to prior and informed consent, the idea of sustained consent. This is emphasized that, in fact, working with safeguarding and intangible heritage, it's an iterative project, something that you have to start over and over again. And while doing this, try to keep the in balance with what those local communities, groups, and individuals think. On the other hand, what is connected to this, or should be connected, is a toolbox of tools for ethics, and this toolbox is still missing. And that's where we are looking for a group like yours to actually make a number of tools, identify a number of tools on how to make this safeguarding process and this idea, for instance, of prior and sustained informed consent work. What I'm interested in a lot is what happens in museums. And there's this recent book that you probably know, Jorijn Smith's book, Emotional Heritage, which has emotional heritage visitor engagement at museums and heritage sites. If you're a museum professional, you should get quite nervous when reading the book, because what Jorijn Smith says after interviewing more than 4,000 people all over the world is that while a lot of museums want to act in an ethical way and to improve the world, and in fact try to teach something to the visitors and try to take them along in the story of improving the world, what she demonstrates is that this fails in most institutions, and that most people come to a museum to be reinforced and to reassured that the way they are thinking, that's the right way to do. And in this book, Jorijn Smith actually dismisses the notion that museums or heritage sites are there to teach and to try to change something, even for school children and so on. So it's quite sobering and and for me, unacceptable conclusion that Laurie Jane Smith draws, and that's why I think it's interesting to try to find a remedy. And one of the remedies that is being offered is also a notion that Jorijn mentioned. It's this multi-perspectivity. That's what history teachers think they can offer to show a problem and to consider a problem from different sides, to make the problem bigger and to find ways of dealing with controversies. That's one of the things I'm working on at the moment, to try in these COVID times to explore a number of programs like Debate Graph that's open for free, to look at an argument and a controversy from different perspectives. And I think this is also something that museums can experiment with. So to conclude my story, I think this book by Laurie Jane Smith, published a few months ago, it really offers a very sobering, and we can do a lot of programs about ethics. Her point is that in museums they fail to a large extent, and so the challenge is so first the question, should museums try to transform the visitors that are visiting the museum? Is that their task? And how can we do this? And dealing with controversies is perhaps one of the ways to do it. So perhaps even embracing dilemmas, the topic of this group, could be a way forward. Or do we just stand aside? That's also one of the questions that Jorijn proposed. Should you walk away or not engage in this intangible heritage field, and or try to address it? And if addressing it, how to do that? And is a museum able to do that? According to Laurie Jane Smith, not very well, but according to you, I hope you can make a difference. Okay, that's where I want to finish for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess we are here to give some hope that the author wasn't quite right when she stated that we are here not to change people's opinion. My own experience doesn't support quite that conclusion, and I guess that the next speakers and the very next speaker, who is Leena Marsio, will also have somewhat more optimistic vision of that. So Leena Marsio comes from Finland, and she works in the Finnish Heritage Agency as senior advisor. She is the coordinator of the UNESCO Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage in Finland since 2014. Before, she was working for the government. So in short, Leena has really vast experience, and as far as I remember, she also is into presenting Intangible Heritage Wheel. I don't know if Leena, are you going to talk about this today as well? But anyway, I am very interested to listen to your presentation right now. So welcome.
Now you hear me. So thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be this evening here with you. So, and I think I will now move on to a bit more concrete work on what we have been doing here in Finland in terms of museums. So my organization is the Finnish Heritage Agency. And we're a government agency with around 200 people. And for example, the National Museum of Finland is part of the same organization. I'm myself sitting in the museum development department. So all of my colleagues are working particularly with museums. I'm not actually that much, but for this I have a really keen interest on what the museums are doing and how we could support them in their role. And now I see my slides are not changing for some reason. Sorry, just for a moment. Maybe it's better that I don't put the full screen on. Let's see if that works better then.
Leena, you find downstairs under your, okay, now it works, yes.
Maybe it's just a bit slow. Okay, okay. So yes, what do we do in Finland regarding intangible cultural heritage and museums? So my organization is responsible for the implementation. And the most visible thing that we do around the convention is the Wiki inventory for living heritage. So maybe you already know about these national inventories that are being done in all of the now 180 countries that are part of the convention. I think this is the most visible form of this convention. And maybe you also know that these inventories are sort of community-based. So it is the communities themselves that are more or less inventorying their heritage. But of course, the processes are different in different kind of countries. From there, from the wiki, it's possible to apply for the national inventory. And one of our tools, how we work together with the communities, are these circles of living heritage. And these are multi-stakeholder networks. And many museums take part on these circles. For example, in the Circle of Crafts, there are crafts museums from Finland, and they have also played a supporting role in many of the ICH elements that we have in our inventories. Sorry, it's not changing again. And not letting me out either. This is the thing. It's really nice when we can communicate all over across the borders, but then this happens. I will not be. Just a moment. I try once more, and if it doesn't work, then I will just run it through and explain what I was going to say. So sorry for this. So Lidija, you also have my presentation. I just sent it to you like 10 minutes ago, if you would like to do the sharing, but I will try once more. So now you see something.
Yes.
Okay.
Don't put it don't stretch it as on the whole screen.
Yes, it might be that. Yes, that might be the problem. So we've been working with the museum in terms of ICH and have joined seminars and webinars. And my impression is that the Finnish museums are really interested in this topic. And actually, when it comes to the backbone or the framework here in Finland, so for example, last year we had both in the Museums Act, Intangible Cultural Heritage was mentioned, also in the Act on Municipal Cultural Activities, even the government program, we will make sure that intangible cultural heritage is protected. Sorry for the bad translation, I was not there to make it to be safeguarding, but anyhow, so it is already there in 2 acts and so on. So, but I think for us, the wonderful project that Jorijn and others have been working on has been a really good input to our process. So we think that the knowledge is there and the interest is there, but what we have been missing so far are the tools. How can we help museums to dig deeper and understand what they should be doing? And thanks for the Intangible Cultural Heritage and Museums project, we now have that. And actually just a month ago, we had a joint seminar, Nordic Museums and Intangible Cultural Heritage, where we had 190 people from 12 countries registering for the event. So that clearly shows the interest in the field. But for example, one thing that we did, that we have translated into Finnish, some of their tools, and we found very inspiring their set of inspiration cards. Maybe, I don't know if you, Jorijn, want to link also on the chat box, the card set or maybe the toolbox at least. So, but we made our own version. So there is the English toolkit about those 5 Central European countries, but we wanted to make our own. So we asked the Finnish Museum to send in their own examples, and we have a very nice set of 40 examples from different museums. So they could themselves see, actually already realize what they've been doing along the theme. But just lastly, one case that I would like to highlight here. So one of the cooperation projects we've done together with the Finnish National Museum was an event, Amengo Museum, our museum, which was a one-day event in the National Museum together with the Finnish Roma people on their culture and on their heritage. And it was on the week of the International Day of the Roma people or Romani people. And it was a successful event all in all, but there were many different kind of details along the process that we needed to consider carefully. So we ended up in a one-day event where it was possible to even for a non-Roma to dress up in their costume, listen to panel discussions about Roma traditions and their heritage, get to know their jewelry. And for example, there was a panel discussion on well, both about the Roma ICH, but about the horsemanship among the Roma people. And even a catwalk on how the Roma woman's fashion had changed over decades. So it was organized in the National Museum in the city center of Helsinki. But I would say we had a very nice half-year process maybe before the event with the Roma Advisory Board, with the Finnish Roma Association, and then also individual Roma activists who, for example, took care of the jewelry collection or the catwalk, or who organized this panel discussion around the horsemanship. And we got around 350 participants, and around half of them were Roma people, which I thought it was a really success. So they really took over the museum. But I think if we later have then more deeper discussion on the ethical dimensions, first of all, the ownership. So making such a big event on the Roma and their culture, it was really essential that from the start we were working together with the communities and NGOs representing them. But there again we come to the question, though it is the Finnish Roma Board, though it is the NGOs, who is it really then representing? Many details concerned in the planning related to the role of the generations, at least here among the Finnish Kale Roma, there are really strict rules on young people and old people and their hierarchy. And for example, it can be really physical. So when we had the National Museum, the younger ones could not be in an upper level than the older people. So we needed to make special arrangements to see that the generations were not sort of being unpolite towards each other. Or then the continuity. And I think this has been one of the really nice things that the National Museum has been emphasizing, so that we are not just doing one-off event, but then since after the event, one of the next steps was, after this really nice panel discussion on the horsemanship of the Roma, started the process to gather information. What is their horsemanship in Finland nowadays? And this ended in a really nice article into our wiki inventory, and they also applied for the national inventory and were accepted. So I can also put the link on the chat box then later for you to have a look. So, but I think this was something really nice, concrete. And also now for the first time ever for this autumn, there is an intern, a Roma woman in the Finnish National Museum, who is in her everyday work bringing up the voice of the Roma people, and also looking into the collections, also looking into the exhibitions on how could they better take into account all kind of cultural minorities, but especially coming from her background. So these were maybe the concrete and hopefully inspiring and also positive examples that I had from Finland. And thank you, and looking forward for the discussion and also your questions.
Indeed, they were, Leena, and thank you so much for your inspirational talk. And I guess that Joanne also has many fun examples that could be also very not interesting, but also inspirational, since she has been working over 30 years in the fields of tangible and intangible heritage in the context of museums and wider heritage communities and tourism in the UK and internationally. As far as I know, Joanne, you are also active in Canada right now. So I can't see your icon, but I think you are with us, aren't you, Joanne? Yes, you are. So please start your presentation, Joanne, and welcome to the panel.
Good morning, as it is here in Canada. Thank you for the invitation.
Sorry.
Delighted to be here. Yeah, it's not too early now. It's getting better. So I'm not sharing a screen. I'm just going to talk and share a few thoughts. And really sort of thinking, do museums have a role in safeguarding ICH? You know, traditionally, many museums have been operating within what is essentially a colonial construct. And this is something that I'm very much, is driven home to me working here in British Columbia in Canada, and have often been appropriators of objects, and then the kind of collection of knowledge has been haphazard at best and at other times extracted. And now there's many, you know, there's a lot of thing around reuniting objects with their many contexts. You know, and objects go through various contexts as it travels through time. And ICH is often the context where we're looking to collect ethically. And in order to do that, you're always going to need individual groups, communities. It's always going to have to be that as Jorijn mentioned, the co-collecting, the co-curating, the co-governance. And I think to that point, you know, are we ready for that? And what are you prepared to give up? You know, what are you prepared to give, you know, in terms of this area, this place of you have to give up and cooperate. You have to share the power. And there is power in these constructs. They've been used in many different contexts around the world, sometimes in quite alarming and exploitative ways. The museums are not neutral spaces. So in order to work in this way and embrace it fully, you have to think about what, as a museum, and the traditional roles of museums, and perhaps even their own ICH, what are you going to change and what are you going to give up? So I started really, you know, most of my work in life has actually been involving ICH within a museum context without me sort of realizing or thinking it. It only became a construct for me in sort of 2007 on a request of working in Scotland from quite a number of community-run museums asking for advice and support about how to do the ICH within the museum context. And they were already doing it, many of them. So a lot of it came from a Gaelic-based culture, where the museum itself was already part of community, was you know, a physical infrastructure used for cultural events, and ICH was naturally happening within that space. And out of that work, the definition that Scotland, you know, developed, and I know that many other countries have started to do that, and it's now commonplace, is that inclusive definition, embracing ICH in Scotland rather than Scottish ICH. That was the example at the time. And that, I think that's a good starting point. Again, that inclusivity, that you are working in community with people, you are part of community, and that's another important point. I know that Filomena in Portugal has very much, you know, developed that area thinking. And the museum responsibility, what is our responsibilities within all that, is that responsibility to, you know, not only develop, initiate, but to maintain relationships. And again, to Jorijn's point, are you ready for that journey? Because it's a huge investment. And sometimes when you know, you're not speaking for people, which is, you know, to Marc's point in the emotional museum, it's other people's lived experiences, and we're creating or trying to create the space for ICH within the museum context. And often the mistake around that is that it becomes just preserved oral histories, not actual living intangible cultural heritage. That's often, you know, people say, well, we're doing intangible heritage because we've got all these oral histories, but it depends what they're speaking about. That's the kind of common mistake people make. And what are our bottom lines? I mean, to the wiki stuff and the wiki experience, and that's what say we developed in Scotland when I was working with all museums there. That you know, it's within the 2003 convention, it's really about upholding human rights. So what happens to the other stuff? You know, what's the museum's responsibility within that field in terms of ICH that doesn't, you know, that actually actively undermines human rights? What's our role within that, and what are the ethical dilemmas around approaching that difficult or contested heritage? But one of the things I would say is that working with ICH in a museum context, or vice ICH context, and coming to museums, is the opportunity it provides for a museum to literally live and breathe participative practice, because it's the only way you can approach this area, and giving up that power. And one of the examples I've seen in the COVID context is different museums' approaches to shaping future collections of this time, and more museums starting to embrace perhaps a more participative and activist role in the current changed times. The parameters have changed, our lives have changed, and the opportunities that has thrown up. So even in the current museum, I'm working in the Royal BC Museum of just trying to shape future collections, of involving the public in that participative approach of deciding what is collected, rather than that sole, the curator is the complete shaper of future collections, and the ICH that is related around and growing and being made every day around the COVID-19 experiences, and how it is transcending that our local one-to-one experience to the global. And living on an island, that can be quite a sobering prospect at times. I think we've got 3 days of food supplies, I was told on Friday. So, but it's, you know, that there is an opportunity around that, and you were seeing museums around the world embracing that participative. And it's interesting to, you know, do a quick Google search. You'll see, you know, museums all over the world approaching this, and some very different approaches. But in the museum I'm working in at the moment, we've said, asking the public, what would you see as, you know, how would you remember this time? How do you want this time to be remembered? And what do you want to see in the collection? And what does it look like? So I can talk, you know, fairly confidently around Scotland. I've been more hesitant about talking about what's happening here and the work I'm doing in Canada, because I don't want to speak on behalf of others. But some of, you know, just drilling down to particular examples, and again, that power, you know, we're working in digital repatriation, is a huge area. And we have a lot of language tapes in our collections that are being repatriated. but it's now thinking really, if you create a film, you know, we're filming digital repatriation because we can't physically go to communities and communities can't come into the museum. So we're making films of collections that go back to elders to look at. And it's just thinking about those rights, because anything that you're filming, the IP rights belong to the participants, belong to the people, and ensuring that you're clear about that. Because often a museum will document the process, but then they'll appropriate that, they'll keep that as part of the museum. But you really, in this world of participative, you're working together to create a shared understanding, a shared trust, and you're sharing, you're being permission by the participants to hold on to things that you might want to have in the collection. And that's now, you know, in terms of standard practice and seeing it shift, digital copies used to be okay. Now actually it's the original tapes that need to be repatriated out of archives. And I know, you know, in terms of the professions, the museums and archival areas, this can be quite a big stumbling block. Again, it's having to give up and think about what you're prepared to give up to work in this space of and how important that is at all times. And it's holding, you know, where you're striving to, you know, I think in some ways is that holding in trust, which many museums have done over the years, but actually working alongside people with their heritage and being a place where people want to, you know, like, you know, you mentioned with the Roma community coming in that it makes them their place. So hopefully that will give some ideas around that participative, but also activism, you know, and whose knowledge counts, recognizing other knowledges. And, you know, it mentioned to me on Friday, there's no such thing as universal knowledge. There's really only local knowledge.